You wake up and open your eyes. Well, one eye at least. The other won't open, and the eye that does only opens as much as a slit. Through blurry vision, you look around. The colors and shapes of dense greenery surround you on all sides. The next thing you notice is a sharp pain radiating from your right arm. Looking down, you see there's a big gash on it, covered in white spots that seem to be moving. Maggots. Horrified, you try to reach over and remove them, only to be stopped by an explosion of pain from your collarbone. Then, you notice something wrapped around your waist, a seatbelt. That's when flashes of memory of what happened come flooding into your mind. You frantically look around, trying to find any sign of human life, especially your mother, who had been sitting in the seat next to you what feels like just moments ago. But now, her seat is empty, and there is no living being in sight. You're alone, injured, and nearly blind, strapped into an airline seat in the middle of the jungle.
Okay, Howard. How many is that now?
The current number of push-ups is 5.
Oh, come on.
What's going on? Why are you so sweaty, Grill?
Training for the end. What does it look like?
The end? The end of what?
The end of society, you doof. Could happen any day. I've got to prepare my body to defend myself out there. Speaking of which, I've been thinking about buying some firearms.
Whoa, okay, I'm gonna stop you right there. While I understand your desire to be prepared for unexpected situations, you should really reevaluate your idea of what it means to be prepared, and realize that knowledge is your greatest weapon.
What? Nerds like you won't stand a chance when it all goes down.
I wouldn't be so sure. Take, for example, the harrowing tale of Julian Kupka. On December 24th, 1971, 17-year-old Julian Kupka was excitedly boarding a domestic flight from Lima to Pucallpa, Peru. It was a clear Christmas Eve afternoon, and the airport was bustling with families excited to visit their loved ones for the holidays. Her mother had originally planned to book their flight on either the 19th or 20th. However, since Julian didn't want to miss out on her graduation ceremony and prom on the 23rd, they postponed their trip until the 24th. Little did they know, this sole decision would change their lives forever. As Julian moved through the plane aisles, she finally found it, seat 19F. Her mother made sure to book Julian a window seat, since she knew her daughter loved to take in the spectacular views that she could only get while flying. This window seat, however, would soon show her things that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But for now, as she sat down, she looked out the window and smiled, reminiscing about the heartwarming ceremony that had taken place yesterday. In order to celebrate the academic success of her graduating class, the entire Deutschschule Lima Alexander von Humboldt campus had been decorated.
Geez, that's a mouthful.
Well, it's German, but you could also just call it the Alexander von Humboldt German International School.
Then why didn't you, nerd?
Julian had just finished her senior year of passing a rigorous exam in the institute, offering a hectic curriculum combining German educational standards with local Peruvian requirements.
Okay, brainiac over here.
Well, when you've been brought up in a family of genius scientists, you have to be, to continue their legacy. For Julian, however, it didn't feel like an obligation. She dreamed of following in the footsteps of her mother, Maria Kupka, who was a well-respected voice of authority in the South American ornithology sector, with her work focusing on neotropical bird species. Good question, Bean. An ornithologist is a person who studies birds. This can include focusing on various aspects of avian wildlife like behavior, ecology, physiology, and conservation. Julian was very close with her mother, but less so with her father, Hans Wilhelm Kupka, who was also a dedicated and hard-working zoologist specializing in ornithology and herpetology, the study of reptiles and amphibians. Her parents actually met when they were studying in Germany at the University of Kiel, and coincidentally ended up working on the same research project. Hans was serious and emotionally distant, while Maria was lighthearted and caring. They were near opposites, but their shared love for nature and dedication to their research caused them to form a strong connection and partnership that Julian would later describe as a symbiotic coexistence, but one that would tragically be cut short. Even after their daughter was born in 1954, they continued to work feverishly on their research together at the Museum of Natural History in Lima, Peru, and eventually Panguana, Peru's oldest research station that the two co-founded together in 1968 in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. As Julian put it was not possible for them to be separated. That is, until 1970, when they were forced apart, so that Maria could accompany their daughter while she finished her high school education in Lima and Hans stayed in Panguana to continue the couple's research. And now, over a year later, Julian had passed her exams and the Kupkas would finally be together as a family again. Or so they hoped. During their flight, Julian's mother sat in the seat next to her, sharing how much her father had been missing them. The atmosphere inside the plane was vibrant, and people were excited to visit their families for a joyful holiday. But one announcement from the co-pilot shifted the mood entirely. Passengers, we inform you that the area of turbulence we are going through is due to a major storm over the Amazon jungle. Fasten seatbelts. It had been 40 minutes since the plane took off and had peacefully crossed the Peruvian Andes in good weather. However, as it flew over Oyon in the Sierra de Lima, the pilots noticed a huge storm coming ahead.
Why were they going straight into a storm? Shouldn't they try to avoid it?
Well, ideally, yes, but it was the Christmas season, and all other flight routes were completely full. Also, airplanes are generally built strong enough to survive mild storms.
But I mean, it's always better safe than sorry, right?
You're right. However, the airline they were flying with, LANSA, had a recent tendency of being sorry rather than safe. In fact, when Maria was booking their flight, Hans had told her, please don't fly with LANSA, any other airline, but not LANSA. But on Christmas Eve, the only flight available from Lima to Pucallpa was through LANSA. And, unfortunately, Julian's father had been right to worry. There had been prior incidents. For example, on April 27, 1966, LANSA Flight 501 had been flying from Lima to Cusco when it crashed into the Andes Mountains at an altitude of about 16,000 feet. All 49 passengers and crew members on board were killed.
Oh man.
And that's not all. On August 9, 1970, LANSA Express 502 also crashed into the mountain on the way to Cusco, but this time, shortly after takeoff. All 99 passengers and 6 crew members on board were killed, making it one of the deadliest aviation accidents in Peru's history. So, when the announcement about poor weather sounded from the speakers, many people were on edge. Julian, however, remained calm and fastened her seatbelt. It wasn't her first time flying. She actually had to travel often because of her parents' field of work. Julian's mother, on the other hand, was known to never like flying and became extremely anxious. According to Julian, Maria felt that, for such a metal bird to be flying in the sky, was unnatural. And maybe there is something to be said about her beliefs on aviation, because despite all of our advancements in modern technology, all it takes is one strike from Mother Nature to bring humanity's aspirations back down to Earth. It was around late noon, and despite it being a bright day just a few minutes ago, the sky grew dark and the plane began to move deeper into the storm. There was distant lightning, and suddenly, massive turbulence hit, causing everyone to panic. The plane began to jump up and down, and people's belongings, Christmas presents, and cakes fell out of overhead compartments. The lights turned off, and it went pitch black. People screamed and prayed for help. Julianne held her mother's hands, waiting for the turbulence to stop. But that would never happen. After 10 terrifying minutes of white-knuckle turbulence, Julianne saw a bright flash from her window followed by a loud explosion and flames erupting from the right-wing engines. Passengers were thrown into what felt like zero gravity as the plane fell into a nosedive. Julianne turned towards her mother, who looked like a ghost. The only words that could come out of her mouth were, "That is the end. It's all over." At that moment, she heard a loud screeching noise behind her. Turning to her right, she saw a sharp crack appear through the window's side, stretching all the way up to the ceiling. Within a second, the plane wall tore apart, creating a vacuum. She tried to turn back towards her mother, but in the next blink, she was sucked out of the plane, sending her straight into the open air, still strapped to her seat. Julianne plummeted towards the earth, spinning and tumbling at a sickening speed. The last thing Julianne saw was the thick canopy of the Amazon rainforest spinning towards her before losing consciousness.
And what happened to her? Did she survive the fall?
I do not need to conduct calculations in order to predict. that she did not suddenly grow wings and start to fly. Free falling from such an altitude only has one possible outcome. Obviously,
She woke up.
Oh, well, never mind.
Hours later, after free-falling 10,000 feet without a parachute, Julian woke up on the forest floor, battered beyond belief, but, against all odds, alive. It took a few minutes for her to realize what was happening. She looked around and saw that she was still strapped to the plane's chair. She was covered in painful cuts and bruises, with the worst being an ugly gash on her right arm that had botfly maggots crawling in. Horrified, she began to reach over with her left hand to remove them, but immediately stopped when pain erupted from her collarbone. It was broken. A simmering headache followed, and she was sure she must have sustained a concussion from the fall. Julian unfastened her seatbelt and tried to stand, but gasped in pain as she discovered another injury. The ligament in her left knee was severely torn. But what concerned her the most was the inability to see clearly. Julian was short-sighted and wore glasses, but they were gone. To make matters even worse, one of her eyes was completely swollen shut, while the other was blacked out, allowing just a slit of an opening to see through. After a few moments, reality hit her like a brick, and she started panicking. Flashbacks of a bright light and falling from the plane came rushing in, and the first thought in her mind was to look for her mom. But the moment Julian stood up, her impaired vision along with her severe concussion made her dizzy, and she blacked out again.
Man, what a way to spend Christmas Eve. But what caused the plane to break apart midair like that anyway?
Remember the bright flash? Turns out lightning had struck one of the plane's fuel tanks, causing it to explode and the plane to crumble apart in midair. And now, Julian was lying unarmed and unconscious on the bed of a forest, home to some of the most dangerous wild animals on the planet. Huge snakes like the green anaconda, and big cats like jaguars and pumas lurking in search of prey. And if any one of these predators were to come across Julian in her incapacitated state...
Oh, man, just the thought of it is giving me chills.
Yet, luckily, when she regained consciousness, she discovered that the only animals that had fed on her body were mosquitoes and the maggots.
Phew, but I still can't wrap my head around how she survived a 10,000-foot fall.
There were actually some pretty critical factors that contributed to that. Remember how her chair started spinning? Well, it was connected to two other seats, which, as they spun, caused an upward pressure that, along with air resistance, reduced Julian's falling speed. Not to mention, the dense forest canopy played a big part in breaking her fall.
Wait. Wasn't her mother sitting next to her?
That's correct, but all Julian knew was that her mother wasn't when she woke up.
Well, where'd she go then?
After surviving such a traumatic experience, Julian knew she needed to locate other possible survivors, especially her mom. Even when her vision was terribly impaired, she could still hear the familiar sounds, reminding her of the childhood she had spent in the Amazon rainforest. The eerie, drone-like buzz around her indicated the presence of cicadas. She heard the faint sound of a poison dart frog, which the tribal people commonly used to make weapons. As she tried to navigate through the forest's overgrown vegetation, she heard the melancholic sound of her mother's favorite bird, a ground bird known as the undulated tinamou. A part of her actually felt grateful that the plane crashed here and not somewhere unfamiliar. The chances of this happening were extremely low. The plane could have crashed over the sea, over the snow and ice of the Andes, over the dense and treacherous montane forest to its east. All of those would probably have spelled certain death. But here, in the Amazon rainforest, Julian's experience gave her a slight hope of survival. In 1968, when Julian was 14 years old, her parents decided it was finally time to execute their dreams of making a prominent scientific contribution that would be the highlight of their academic careers. So the couple persuaded their employer at Lima's Museum of National History to let them set out on a novel 5-year field research project, the objective of which was to systematically map the fauna, flora, and food chains in a remote 1.8 kilometer square stretch of the Amazon rainforest. This would end up being the Penguana Research Center, named after the local name of Julian's mom's favorite bird, the undulated tinamou, the very first bird that Julian heard as she started to make her way through the forest after the crash. The outside of the facility was covered in vines and trees. Thanks to its location in the middle of the jungle, it was always surrounded by wild animals like howler monkeys and birds. Not only that, but the family would have to shake out their rubber boots every morning to remove venomous spiders that might have crawled in. It may seem bizarre, but for nature lovers like Julian's parents, it was heaven on earth. And having lived there for almost a year, Julian grew to love it too. During her stay, her parents homeschooled her under a strict program. Her father would teach her math, and every morning, both parents would take her to the jungle. There, they taught her valuable lessons like picking your feet off the ground to avoid tripping over roots, and following a stream of water to find a way out when you get lost. Her parents had no way of knowing, of course, that these very lessons would later become Julian's only hope for survival. After 18 months of living in the wild, the educational authorities in March 1970 disapproved of her living in the jungle. They required Julian to return to Lima and take her high school final examinations, which, as we know, she eventually did and graduated on December 23, 1971. Now, unceremoniously reunited with the jungle, Julian's first instinct was to collect resources for her survival, because she had no idea when rescue teams would arrive or if they'd even be able to find her. She was wearing a summer dress, which was ripped in many places, and one of her shoes was missing. But she kept her remaining shoe on, using it to tap the ground and check for snakes. Julian had learned from her dad that snakes in the Amazon rainforest could camouflage as leaves, making them hard to spot. Despite being familiar with the jungle life, her odds of surviving alone, wounded, and without any gear were close to none.
Well, it's not like she's in the desert. It's the biggest forest on the planet. There must be plenty of tree fruit to munch on.
Not exactly. The jungle isn't like how they show it in movies like Tarzan, where resources are ample and easy to obtain. Instead, in tropical rainforests, common fruits like palm tree fruits can grow at a height of at least 20 meters, which is nearly impossible to acquire without proper tools. Those fruits would also need to be cooked before they're edible. The only things Julian could find near her crash site were a Christmas cake that had turned into an inedible mush from the rain and a pack of 30 citrus boiled sour candy, which she decided to keep. But surviving in a jungle is physically exerting on its own, so the body needs even more nutrients than usual. Some boiled sweets wouldn't provide enough sustenance to keep Julian alive. It was day one of surviving alone in the Amazon jungle, and apart from that bag of sour sweets, there was no solid food available. She didn't dare touch the mushrooms growing from trees, suspecting them to be poisonous. But food shortage wasn't the only challenge she was facing. The Amazon rainforest is clustered with vegetation, and every side of the massive jungle looks the same. No matter how far Julian walked to find signs of life or any hints of a way out, every new section of the thicket was seemingly identical to the last, and her impaired vision wasn't helping either. Many times, she thought she was walking in circles. Even if you aren't short-sighted, every tree in the rainforest looks the same. You walk a meter in one direction, and when you turn around, you can't tell which direction you came from, Julian recalled. It was hot and humid during the day, but cold at night, and surviving in a sleeveless dress was like swimming with a spacesuit. Finally, in her expeditions around the crash site, Julian heard a dripping sound. At that moment, her father's words came ringing in her head. If you find moving water, then don't let it out of sight. The stream will take you to a brook. The brook will take you to a river. And there, you will find civilization. Even with no success in finding proper food or a way to treat her injuries, this small discovery was enough to fill Julian's fatigued body with newfound resilience. That was the moment I developed something like a strategy. She began to follow along the stream, hoping to find a river. She knew there was a risk of her accidentally walking over red ants, brambles, or mud-dwelling stingrays, which are infamous for causing blood poisoning. So, since she couldn't see clearly, Julian would first feel around ahead with her covered foot to get an idea of what she was stepping on. The second and third days in the forest went by the same, with Julian following the creek in hopes of finding a river. She would travel mostly in the water, as it was safer than traveling barefoot on land. But in the world's biggest rainforest, nowhere is entirely safe. There was a consistent risk of piranhas and caimans in the water bodies, less threat than the land, but a threat nonetheless. During that time, her only source of nutrition was sucking on 4 pieces of the sour candy a day. But just as Julian's lack of food and energy started to catch up with her, she heard the wheezing sounds of hoitzin birds, known to live on the banks of large rivers. She was ecstatic and followed the birds' calls, and finally, she sensed it. the serene sound of a large body of water flowing in the distance. When the young explorer reached the river, she was taken aback by the sight of a wide array of diverse wildlife spread all around the riverside. There were brocket deer, howler monkeys, and even yakare caimans that would hide away in the river whenever Julian got close to them. But despite the serene beauty of these creatures in their natural habitat, Julian's heart dropped because she knew what it meant. She thought that following the water stream would eventually lead her to civilization and, thus, a way out. But these wild animals don't dwell where humans live. But no matter the possibilities, there was no going back. For the past 3 days, she had heard rescue helicopters fly over the forest several times, looking for survivors. Julian had tried to get their attention, but the dense canopy of large trees made it impossible for them to locate anyone past the wreckage. Julian knew the only way to stay alive was to keep going. I just stuck to my mantra that I had to get out of there. On the 4th day, as she slowly made her way along the riverbank, the bill-snapping sound of king vultures fell on Julian's ears, filling her with fear. She had learned during her time at the reserve that they only gather where there is a large amount of decaying flesh, which, in this case, meant crash victims. Julian tried not to think about it, but it only took one dreadful turn of her head for her to come face to face with the horrific reality. Right before her still mostly swollen shut eyes laid 3 bodies strapped to airplane seats with their heads rammed into the ground. She was horrified. It was the first time the young teen had seen a dead body. The first thought that came to her was, Mom.
Was it her?
No matter how much she wanted to turn away and never look back, Julian moved in closer to inspect the bodies. If one of them was her mother, she needed to know. But when she touched the hands of the woman's corpse, she could feel it had painted nails. Her mother hated using nail polish. The young survivor felt a sense of relief wash over her, followed by guilt, since it was still someone's dead body. Julian looked around for food to salvage, but there were no snacks on any of the passengers, and with a heavy heart, Julian continued on her track along the riverbank. A week passed, and she ran out of the pack of sweets she had been surviving on. She tried to catch fish in the stream, but her attempts remained unsuccessful. Her sole source of nourishment was the river water, which was filled with sediments and provided the bare minimum of minerals she needed to keep going, but just barely. The lack of proper food and nutrition took a toll on her body, making her weak and apathetic. 10 days after the crash, Julian lost hope. She simply laid down and let herself float away with the river current. But things took a turn on the 11th day. Due to depleted energy, she lost consciousness while still in the river, and when she woke up, the current had washed her on the side of a sandbank. It took her a second and lots of rapid blinking to realize what was in front of her. There was a large boat just a few feet away from where she was lying. Julian simply couldn't believe it. I thought, now you have gone crazy. You're hallucinating. She finally found signs of human life, but Julian's struggle wasn't over yet. She was on the brink of collapse, and the infection from her wounds had slowly spread throughout her system. If she did not receive immediate help, she would succumb to her injured and famished state. However, seeing the boat brought back the hope she had lost. With newfound determination, she started walking, almost crawling, along a path from where she found the boat. Surely enough, there was a small hut at the end of it. It had a roof made of pine leaves, with a small gasoline canister at the corner. Time was of the essence, and it was as if her life was slipping out of her body with each step. Julian remembered her dad treating the family pet dog's wounds by pouring gasoline on them, so she tried to do the same. Her right arm was deeply infested with maggots, and as she poured, they attempted to crawl further inward. Julian managed to pull out about 30 of them and was proud of it, but her struggle drained away the last bit of energy she had left. Julian laid on the hut's floor, prayed that the boat owner would return, and slowly faded out of consciousness. Just a few hours later, she opened her eyes to 2 men standing above her still body. At first, she thought she was dreaming. It had been 11 days of excruciating struggle, and yet she couldn't grasp the possibility of being saved. I saw that I was saved, but it didn't seem real until they started talking to me. Julian talked to them in Spanish and learned that the boat actually belonged to 5 men. These hunters and woodcutters were traveling into the forest to collect wood and prey, but they had to take shelter to avoid an unexpected downpour, which is a common occurrence in the world's largest tropical rainforest. The men initially thought Julian to be a water spirit called Yamanya, from their local legend and Yoruba religion. Julian told them she was on the Lanza Flight 508 that had crashed and asked the woodcutters if they had seen or heard of other survivors. But the two men informed her that the plane had not been found. She also learned that the river she had been floating along for the past week was the Shibanya River, which ended in a small village settlement that was, coincidentally, near the Penguana research station founded by her parents. The woodcutters used a canoe to bring Julian, weak but alive, to the nearest medical center in the village, an 11-hour paddle from where they were. Once they arrived, the rescue teams were called. On the same day, Julian finally heard the sound of a rescue helicopter landing, and she was airlifted to a hospital in Peru, where her father was anxiously waiting for her. Upon seeing his daughter, who had just survived 11 days in the rainforest, Hans Kupka couldn't say anything but hold her, as if trying to accept the reality that she was actually alive. Julian described the crash to him, and then even set out with a search party to look for her mother. She found out later that the plane had crashed 50 kilometers from the Penguana Biological Research Center and had killed all remaining 91 passengers on board.
No one else survived?
The research team informed her that 14 other passengers did survive the crash, but died later on due to their injuries while waiting to be rescued.
That's horrible.
What's worse is that Julian's mother was one of them. For Julian, however, getting rescued was not the end of her struggle. The tragedy had left a deep impact on her mental health. I had nightmares for a long time, for years. And of course, the grief about my mother's death and that of the other people came back again and again. The thought, why was I the only survivor, haunts me. It always will. When the search was over, Julian tried to live peacefully in Peru. But the news of a 17-year-old sole survivor of one of the deadliest aviation disasters spread like wildfire. She would get recognized everywhere she went, with people trying to ask her questions, pushing her into a constant state of PTSD. Well-being, PTSD, also known as post-traumatic stress disorder, is when the flashbacks of a past tragedy resurface, causing symptoms that make daily life difficult. In Julian's case, she had described having reoccurring nightmares, flashbacks, and intense fear related to flying in thunderstorms for many years after the crash, which are all common symptoms of PTSD. Her father persuaded her to return to Germany, their native homeland, in order to live a quieter life and allow her time to heal physically and mentally. The sole survivor's life slowly fell back on track as she followed her parents' footsteps and pursued higher education. She even published her thesis, Ecological Study of a Bat Colony in the Tropical Rainforest of Peru, in 1987. But the scars of the incident never left her. Julian remained silent about her experience for several years. It wasn't until the late 1980s that she finally decided to share her story after getting a call from filmmaker Werner Herzog, who had almost booked the same flight but missed it and wanted to make a film about Julian's experience. The film Wings of Hope, released in 1998, proved to be a healing experience for her and even strengthened her connection with the Amazon jungle. If the plane hadn't crashed, I might have gone on to study biology like my parents anyway, but I wouldn't have had such an intense relationship with the jungle. Some people think jungles are hostile environments, a green hell. But for me, it was the opposite. It saved my life. When her father died in 2000, she became the director of the Penguana Foundation and protected its biodiversity. She eventually married a fellow scientist and has been working on the Institute's progress ever since.
Okay, you got me, bro. Julianne's a badass. Maybe I should take a page out of her book and read some books on wilderness stuff. Because as it stands right now, I wouldn't know squat about surviving out there if it came to it.
Wise choice, Grill. And if you folks at home enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. It's the best thing you can do to help us keep making more videos, like this one about a castaway who claims to have survived alone out on the open ocean for over a year with no food, no water, and no equipment. How? The answer is so unbelievable that he was sued for $1 million. Find out more by clicking the video on your screen now.